February 2025. It will officially be 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and yet Vladimir Putin has almost nothing to show for it. What was initially supposed to be a swift, decisive victory has turned into one of the most embarrassing chapters in modern Russian history. Instead of capturing Kiev within days, as many predicted, Putin's invasion has resulted in over 1 million casualties, lost billions of dollars in military equipment, and a catastrophic blow to the reputation of the Russian Federation on the global stage. Even more humiliating is the fact that Putin has also managed to lose hundreds of miles of his own territory in Russia's Kursk region, territory that Ukraine has controlled since August last year and still continues to hold to this day. It was obvious that Putin would try to take back his territory, but then Donald Trump won the US presidential election in November. And if you remember, Trump famously declared he'd stop the Russia-Ukraine war on day one of his presidency. Whether or not that's realistic is up for debate. But one thing is certain: any peace talks will require both sides to negotiate from positions of strength. For Ukraine, their control over Kursk gives them a crucial bargaining chip. For Russia, it's a glaring weakness they can't ignore. So to turn the tide, Putin launched what he called a special operation to retake Kursk, deploying over 50,000 troops in the region. But it's been 5 months since this campaign began, and so far the results have been nothing short of disastrous. On New Year's Day, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrskyi, revealed that Russian forces had already suffered over 38,000 casualties in this campaign alone, with at least 15,000 of those being killed in action. In addition to this, Russia has also lost more than 1,000 pieces of military equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery systems. That's a shocking 76% casualty rate for the forces deployed in Kursk, and by the time you're watching this video, that number could easily surpass 80%. Meanwhile, Ukraine is not only holding its ground, but they're also striking back and launching new counterattacks. Just days ago, Ukrainian forces launched another round of attacks in Kursk, catching Russian troops off guard yet again. It's becoming painfully obvious that Putin is driving his country and military straight into the ground. This latest counteroffensive in Kursk is no different. Instead of regaining control, Russia is losing thousands of troops, equipment, and morale at a rate that's simply unsustainable. But before we get into the specifics of Russia's counteroffensive, please take a moment to drop a like on this video. It helps us fight against the algorithm and the inevitable wave of Russian bots who will try to dislike or report this video. Your support is what keeps us going, so thank you. And now let's break down why capturing Kursk is so important for Ukraine and how history might be repeating itself. You see, we all know that Ukraine is much weaker than Russia, at least on paper, and yet it's holding its ground. If this sounds surprising, it shouldn't. Because back in 1939, a similar thing happened to Finland too. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was riding high on its power. The Red Army had recently rolled through eastern Poland, carving up territory with ease. Stalin thought Finland would be just as simple to conquer. Initially, the Soviets demanded that Finland hand over key border areas to ensure Soviet security, particularly land near Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. Naturally, the Finns refused. For them, it wasn't just about land. It was about sovereignty, identity, and pride. But Stalin wasn't the kind of guy who took no for an answer, so the Soviets decided to invade Finland. They were so confident of their superiority that they didn't even bother preparing for a prolonged conflict. They thought it would be over in weeks. Sound familiar, right? But Finland wasn't about to just give away its territory. They knew they couldn't match the Soviets in numbers, firepower, or resources. The Red Army had over 1 million soldiers. Finland had less than 350,000. The Soviets had thousands of tanks and aircraft, while Finland had a handful of outdated ones. On paper, it was a hopeless fight. Yet what the Finns lacked in resources, they more than made up for in strategy, terrain knowledge, and sheer determination. Finns' approach to this battle was brutally effective. They turned to guerrilla warfare, using hit-and-run tactics to harass and confuse the larger Soviet forces. They also leveraged Finland's harsh winter, a winter so severe that Soviet tanks and trucks froze in place, while Finnish troops, dressed in white camouflage, moved through the snow like ghosts. They cut off Soviet supply lines, ambushed poorly prepared Soviet convoys, and lured entire divisions into frozen forests. One of their most famous tactics involved the use of madi, a Finnish term meaning block of wood. The Finns would split large Soviet units into smaller, isolated groups and then pick them off one by one. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Finns inflicted devastating losses on the Soviets. In just 3 months, they killed over 126,000 Soviet troops while losing less than 26,000 of their own. Now compare this to what Ukraine is doing today. Ukraine isn't fighting on equal terms with Russia. They don't have the manpower or the vast arsenal that Moscow commands. But they've shown that wars aren't always won by the bigger army. They're won by the smarter one. Much like Finland in the Winter War, Ukraine has turned its disadvantages into opportunities. They've embraced tactical innovation using tools like FPV drones for reconnaissance and precision strikes, alongside advanced Western weapons like HIMARS, ATACMS, and Storm Shadow missiles to level the playing field. Ukraine's understanding of its terrain, coupled with an emphasis on asymmetric warfare, has worn down Russian forces. Trenches, minefields, and ambushes have replaced large-scale assaults, turning every inch of land into a nightmare for the invaders. Just like Finland's hit-and-run tactics, Ukraine has mastered the art of striking where it hurts the most: supply lines, ammunition depots, and command centers, while minimizing their own casualties. But here's the hard truth. Finland knew they were going to win. They simply didn't have the resources to match the Soviet Union's sheer size and firepower indefinitely. Yet Finland's goal wasn't a total victory, it was survival. They made the war so costly for Stalin that he had no choice but to negotiate, and Ukraine is trying to do the same to Russia. By March 1940, after 3 brutal months, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. They ceded 11% of their territory, including important borderlands, but they retained their independence. That's a massive win considering Stalin's original plan was to annex Finland entirely. The Winter War didn't end with a clear victory for Finland, but it also wasn't a Soviet triumph. Instead, it left the Red Army humiliated, with staggering losses and a reputation that had taken a significant hit. Stalin had underestimated a smaller, weaker opponent, a mistake Putin seems to be repeating in Ukraine. What made Finland's position so strong during negotiations was their ability to fight back and even reclaim some Soviet-occupied territory. They didn't just sit on the defensive, they went on the offensive, capturing key areas that they later used as bargaining chips. This strategy forced the Soviet Union to rethink their approach and settle for much less than they had initially demanded. Again, Ukraine is trying to do the same. By capturing hundreds of miles of Russian territory in its counteroffensives, Ukraine has managed to put Russia on the defensive. These captured lands are political leverage, and any future peace talks will hinge on control over these contested areas. Sure, Donald Trump's coming to power is a huge deal for Ukraine. After all, it's no secret that Ukraine has been standing strong only because of the unwavering support from its allies, and most importantly, from the United States. Every year, the United States sends billions of dollars in aid, much more than any other country, and the numbers speak for themselves. As of September 30th, 2024, the U.S. has committed a staggering $183 billion to Ukraine, with $130.1 billion already allocated and $86.7 billion dispersed. No other country comes close to this level of commitment. Not only that, but since 2014, long before the full-scale invasion, the U.S. has been actively training Ukrainian forces through programs like Operation Fearless Guardian. Ukrainian soldiers have been flown to Germany, Poland, and even U.S. training grounds to learn how to operate advanced systems like HIMARS and Patriot missiles. Similarly, American intelligence has also been a game changer. Early in the war, U.S. intelligence alerted Ukraine to Russian plans to encircle Kiev, allowing Ukrainian forces to prepare and ultimately repel the attack. Later, during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, U.S. satellite imagery helped Ukraine pinpoint weak spots in Russian defenses, leading to one of the most significant victories of the war. Even today, American reconnaissance plays a key role in helping Ukraine identify and strike high-value targets behind enemy lines. What I'm trying to say here is that the United States plays a key role, and if Trump's administration were to pitch a peace plan, which might not align with Kyiv's objectives, then Kyiv still has little to no choice to accept. Because if they deny, and as a result, if US support were to waver or come with more conditions that force Ukraine into compromises, the balance of power could shift dramatically. Without US backing, Ukraine would face significant challenges in holding its ground against Russian aggression. This is why Ukraine's territorial gains are so crucial. By capturing and holding Russian land, Ukraine is creating bargaining power that it can use in any negotiations, just like Finland did. That's why last summer, on August 6, 2024, Ukraine stunned the world with a daring and well-coordinated offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast. At dawn, a Ukrainian force of around 1,000 troops, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, crossed the border into Kursk Oblast. Their goal was clear: to disrupt Russian defenses, seize strategic locations, and create chaos among the occupying forces. For weeks leading up to this, Russian forces in Kursk had grown complacent and lazy. Their focus was split between maintaining supply lines and preparing for the occasional Ukrainian drone attack. What they didn't anticipate was a full-scale ground assault. In an instant, Ukraine brought the fight to Russia's doorstep with a bold offensive targeting key infrastructure and strategic points. The R-200 highway, a lifeline for Russian logistics in the region, became a primary focus. The initial push was so effective that within the first few hours, Ukrainian troops had seized several villages and critical checkpoints in the area. Those losses immediately disrupted supply chains and forced Russian troops to retreat chaotically. Reports suggest that many units didn't even have clear orders on how to respond. A captured Russian soldier later revealed that their commanders had dismissed the possibility of a Ukrainian incursion, labeling it impossible due to Ukraine's supposed lack of resources. Adding to the confusion was Ukraine's effective use of electronic warfare. Advanced jamming systems disabled Russian communications, rendering their drones useless and leaving many units blind to the unfolding situation. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, relied on real-time intelligence gathered by their drones and reconnaissance units, giving them a decisive advantage. But Ukraine didn't stop there. Anticipating a Russian counteroffensive, Ukrainian engineers quickly fortified the area. Heavy-duty trench-digging machines, equipment previously used in their Donetsk operations, were brought in to create defensive structures within hours. Mines were strategically laid, anti-tank barriers were erected, and sniper teams were positioned to cover key areas. Ukrainian forces effectively turned the captured territory into a fortress. If this wasn't enough, then let me tell you that Ukrainian drones continued to dominate the skies. Equipped with thermal imaging, these drones tracked Russian movements in real time. One Ukrainian officer described, "We knew exactly where they were and what they were planning before they even moved." By the time Russian forces managed to regroup, they were already at a disadvantage. Their delayed and disorganized counterattacks were met with fierce resistance from Ukraine's well-prepared defenses. Moreover, even this time, on their own land, Russian commanders relied on the same outdated tactics. Waves of infantry supported by tanks were sent straight into well-prepared Ukrainian defenses. But Ukraine anticipated this predictable response. Mines, strategically placed along likely routes, and anti-tank missiles destroyed Russian vehicles with precision. Ukrainian snipers, positioned across fortified lines, picked off advancing soldiers while drones hovering overhead delivered precise strikes, further decimating the Russian assault. The lack of strategic foresight drew heavy criticism from Russia's own ranks. Pro-Russian military bloggers openly condemned the operation. One well-known blogger even called it a complete disaster, writing, "Our commanders underestimated the Ukrainians, and now we're paying the price. They turned our own tactics against us." Within a few days, Ukrainian troops had seized control of up to 1,300 square kilometers of Russian territory, an area roughly equivalent to Greater London. This included 92 settlements, many of which were small but strategically located to provide control over vital roads and supply routes. This surprise offensive turned into a domino effect that reshaped the entire dynamics of the war in favor of Ukraine. Because, as it turns out, Putin made a series of costly decisions. Among the most significant was the redeployment of troops from two key regions, Donetsk and Kharkiv. Both areas had been the focus of intense Russian efforts throughout 2023 and into 2024. and pulling troops from these fronts to reinforce Kursk came at a steep price. For much of 2023, Donetsk was a priority for Russian forces. After capturing the strategic city of Bakhmut in May 2023, following months of brutal fighting, Russia declared it a major victory. However, the cost was astronomical, with tens of thousands of casualties and the loss of significant equipment. From Bakhmut, Russian forces aimed to push westward toward Pokrovsk, a critical logistics hub, and eventually into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. By late 2023, Russian troops were closing in on Pokrovsk from multiple directions. They had captured several villages in the area, tightening the noose around the city. Ukrainian defenders were stretched thin, trying to hold the line while also preparing for potential breakthroughs in other regions, including Zaporizhzhia and Kharkiv. But the Kursk offensive changed everything. Within days of Ukraine's surprise attack, Russia began shifting troops and resources from Donetsk to reinforce its crumbling defenses in Kursk. According to Ukrainian intelligence, several elite units that had been critical in Russia's earlier successes in Donetsk were redeployed to Kursk within the first week of the offensive. For Ukraine, this pullback was a massive relief. With fewer Russian troops on the ground, Ukrainian forces in Donetsk were able to regroup, strengthen their defenses, and even launch limited counterattacks. By October 2024, the threat to Pokrovsk had significantly diminished, allowing Ukraine to focus on securing other vulnerable parts of the region. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, had been another focus for Russian forces. After failing to capture the city in 2022, Russia spent much of 2023 trying to regain control of key border areas and push deeper into Ukrainian territory. By mid-2023, Russian forces had made some progress, capturing several towns and villages near the Kharkiv border. Ukrainian defenders were again stretched thin, struggling to hold their positions while dealing with Russian offensives on multiple fronts. But the Kursk offensive disrupted these plans. Russia's redeployment of troops from Kharkiv to Kursk exposed critical weaknesses in its strategy. Without enough manpower to maintain a strong presence in Kharkiv, Russian commanders had to rely on poorly trained conscripts and hastily assembled militia units to hold the line. These underprepared forces were no match for Ukraine's well-trained and better-equipped troops, who quickly exploited the gaps in Russia's defenses. By late 2024, the situation in Kharkiv had improved dramatically for Ukraine. Russian advances stalled, and Ukrainian forces began reclaiming lost territory. The pullback of Russian troops not only weakened Russia's hold on Kharkiv, but also revealed the growing fragility of its broader strategy. But then you'd think, at the very least, that Russia managed to accomplish something significant in Kursk, right? Turns out they didn't. Sure, they were able to slow Ukraine's progress into their territory, but stopping an advance isn't the same as pushing your enemy back. When it comes to Kursk, Russia's efforts to reclaim lost ground have been, at best, minimal, and, at worst, downright humiliating. Instead of addressing their failures, Russian propaganda has gone into overdrive, spinning narratives so far from reality that they're almost laughable. Take, for example, Apty Aronovich Alaudinov, a Russian major general and prominent figure in the 141st Motorized Regiment of the National Guard. On social media, Alaudinov claimed that on August 6th, Ukraine had launched its offensive with an unbelievable force: 200 tanks, over 400 military vehicles, and 12,000 troops. According to him, all of this was easily destroyed by Russian forces. Sound absurd? That's because it is. In reality, Ukraine's incursion only involved around 1,000 troops and a few dozen vehicles. What makes this even more bizarre is that Alaudinov has transitioned from military general to full-time propagandist. With over 300,000 followers on Telegram, he's become more of a social media influencer than a military leader. His channel is filled with carefully edited videos and photos, all designed to portray Russian dominance. In one post, he even claimed that Russian forces had turned Kursk into an impenetrable fortress. But independent footage and reports from the front lines tell a completely different story. But Alaudinov isn't alone. There are hundreds more like him. But again, the propaganda doesn't matter, because in reality, Ukraine still holds a major portion of territory in the Kursk region. Reports from both Ukrainian and independent sources indicate that Russian counterattacks have been met with heavy resistance and significant casualties. And this is where North Korean troops come into the picture. You see, some say that Putin begged Kim Jong-un for his troops, whereas others say that it was Kim himself who offered the soldiers for a dirt cheap price. Either way, it doesn't matter which story is true. Both are equally terrible because now there are thousands of North Koreans dying in a foreign country in a war that has nothing to do with them. You see, it's not like Ukraine attacked Kursk, Putin panicked, called Kim, and troops magically showed up. Sorry to burst your bubble, but geopolitics doesn't work like that. The reality is that even before Ukraine launched its attack, it was clear to everyone that Ukraine might eventually target weaker Russian border regions. Based on what we talked about Finland, it only makes sense for Ukraine to attack, right? So Putin decided to partner with a foreign nation to send a warning to Ukraine and its allies. That ally, of course, was North Korea, a nation that hasn't been taken seriously on the global stage for decades, but still, it was the best he could get. Months before Ukraine's offensive, Putin made a high-profile visit to North Korea to lay the groundwork for this military partnership. This visit was a big deal because it marked the first time a Russian leader had set foot in North Korea in 24 years. During the visit, Putin and Kim Jong-un signed what they called the North Korea-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty. This treaty was highly detailed, with a preamble and 23 articles outlining how the two nations plan to collaborate. The main focus was, of course, on military cooperation. For instance, Article 4 stated that if either North Korea or Russia was attacked, the other must immediately provide military support. Article 3 was more about peacetime tensions. It essentially said that if either nation felt threatened or suspected of a possible invasion, they'd start discussions to figure out how to respond. In simple terms, this treaty was a deal where North Korea got much-needed technology and resources in exchange for supplying soldiers to Russia. For Kim, this was a huge win. For Putin, well, not so much, because the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia was meant to be a show of strength. Instead, it turned into a public display of Russia's desperation. When Putin brought in 10,000 to 12,000 North Korean troops to bolster his efforts in Kursk, he hoped they would provide a much-needed edge. But from the moment these troops stepped onto Russian soil, it was clear that this plan was falling apart. Far from being the lifeline he desperately needed, these soldiers became a liability. One of the most glaring issues was the language barrier. The North Korean soldiers didn't speak Russian, and the Russians certainly didn't speak Korean. To bridge this gap, the Korean troops were given a crash course in basic Russian military terms. They were also handed small cards with these terms written on them. But let's be real, how do you expect anyone to memorize a new language in a few days, let alone use it effectively in the chaos of war? Imagine being in a trench under fire, trying to remember the Russian word for retreat. By the time you figure it out, it's already too late. This lack of communication created chaos everywhere, during training, in the barracks, and especially on the battlefield. Orders were misunderstood, coordination was non-existent, and even the simplest tasks became monumental challenges. Another issue was the lack of proper training. While some of the 10,000 North Korean troops were part of elite units, the majority were light infantry with minimal combat experience. Many of these soldiers weren't even trained for war. They were used back home for construction work or ceremonial guard duties. And then there's the physical aspect. Years of malnutrition in North Korea had left many of these soldiers physically stunted and weaker than their Russian counterparts. Physical strength is crucial on the battlefield. Whether it's carrying heavy gear, digging trenches, or enduring long hours of combat, these soldiers were already at a disadvantage before they even faced Ukrainian forces. As I said earlier, Ukraine just recently launched new attacks in the Kursk region, but we're not sure how effective they have been. So we're still waiting for reliable updates. Right now, the situation is unclear and filled with exaggerated claims and propaganda from both sides. What we do know is that Kursk has been one of the bloodiest and most fierce fiercely contested regions in the conflict for months. Russia has been pouring resources into the region, throwing wave after wave of troops and equipment into the fight to claw back lost territory. Despite their efforts, progress has been painfully slow and incredibly costly. Reports suggest that Russian forces have managed to clear the salient south of Kursk, capturing parts of the city center and seizing control of the bridge that spans the Kursk Reservoir. This bridge was a key objective, as it provided access to the other side of the waterway, making it easier for Russia to maneuver troops and supplies. In addition to Kursk, Russian forces have also made gains in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, although the fighting there remains far from over. While they've managed to capture sections of these towns, Ukrainian forces still hold the western and northern parts, making full control a distant goal for Russia. Further south, Russian troops have pushed deeper into the Kupiansk area, approaching a critical junction on the Oskol River in Borova. The situation remains fluid in Uspinivka, where fighting over a crucial junction continues. This area serves as a potential withdrawal route for Ukrainian forces in the region, and as of now, it's still under Ukrainian control. However, the pressure is mounting as Russian troops advance from the north and south, narrowing the escape routes available to Ukrainian defenders. If Russia manages to sever this supply line completely, it could create significant challenges for Ukraine's ability to maintain its position in Kursk and the surrounding areas. At its peak, Ukraine controlled between 1,000 and 1,200 square kilometers of territory in Kursk Oblast. Now, that area has shrunk to less than 500 square kilometers. Russian forces are attacking from 4 different directions, making daily advances on at least one front. While this might seem like a win for Russia on paper, the reality is far more complicated. These gains have come at an astronomical cost, with thousands of troops killed or wounded and significant equipment losses. Putin's strategy hasn't evolved in almost 3 years. He's still using the same brute force tactics of overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, throwing bodies at fortified positions in what can only be described as a meat grinder. The casualty rate for Russian forces has climbed to over 1,000 a day. A horrifying number that reflects just how much human life is being wasted in this campaign. In the first waves, Russia sent poorly trained conscripts, prisoners, and even North Korean soldiers. These troops were equipped with outdated weapons, often carrying nothing more than rifles and grenades. Their mission wasn't to win battles, but to act as cannon fodder, absorbing Ukrainian fire and exposing defensive positions. Behind them came better-equipped units meant to exploit any weaknesses the first wave managed to uncover. It's a brutal and inhumane strategy, but it's one that Russia has relied on for decades. The only problem is that Ukraine saw it coming from a mile away. Ukrainian forces had anticipated this exact playbook. They fortified Kursk with multi-layered defenses, making it a nightmare for any advancing army. Every wave of Russian troops was met with precision artillery strikes, coordinated drone attacks, and entrenched defensive positions that left little room for success. Instead of relying on a single, easily breakable line of defense, Ukrainian forces built an intricate web of fortified positions across villages, roads, and strategic locations. Each defensive layer was carefully designed to slow down Russian advances, forcing their troops to bleed resources, manpower, and time. If one position fell, Ukrainian forces would retreat to the next, ready to repeat the process. Villages became strongholds, trenches snaked through fields, barriers blocked main roads, and even civilian buildings were fortified to create defensive hubs. These strongholds forced Russian troops to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground, turning what might have been a straightforward advance into a grueling slog through heavily defended terrain. But that wasn't all. Ukraine layered these defenses with modern static measures like extensive minefields and Dragon's Teeth anti-tank structures. These weren't just deterrents, they were traps. By forcing Russian troops into narrow, predictable paths, Ukraine's defenders created kill zones, where artillery and drones could rain destruction with pinpoint accuracy. Caught in this brutal landscape were the North Korean troops. On December 14th, Ukrainian Military Intelligence, or HUR, confirmed that North Korean soldiers were being deployed in Kursk Oblast to support Russian forces. Barely a month later, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that these troops had already suffered over 4,000 casualties. That's almost half the entire North Korean force sent to fight alongside Russia, obliterated in a matter of weeks. At this rate, Ukraine could eliminate the remaining 8,000 North Korean soldiers within 2 months. Yet Putin keeps doubling down. Instead of investing in training or conserving his dwindling resources, he's sending more poorly prepared troops straight into the grinder. They're deployed only to be chewed up by Ukraine's layered defenses within hours. But no matter how catastrophic the losses are, Putin doesn't care. His only goal is to reclaim every inch of territory Ukraine has seized. It doesn't matter how many soldiers die, how many tanks are destroyed, or how much suffering it causes. Putin remains obsessed with pushing Ukraine back even as the war continues to sap Russia's strength. The problem for Putin is that history is repeating itself in the worst way possible. The parallels with the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union are uncanny. Back then, Stalin's Red Army, one of the most formidable forces in the world, was humiliated by tiny Finland. While the Soviets eventually forced Finland into a peace treaty, the damage was done. The world noticed, and the Soviet Union's image of dominance took a massive hit. Right now, Ukraine is doing the exact same thing to Putin's Russia. Every village or square kilometer of Russian territory Ukraine captures is a direct blow to the Kremlin's carefully curated image of military supremacy. Like Finland, Ukraine is showing the world that even a supposedly mighty military can crumble when faced with resilience, strategy, and determination. In both cases, the larger, supposedly unbeatable nation underestimated its smaller adversary. Stalin didn't think Finland would fight back as fiercely as it did, and Putin made the same mistake with Ukraine. But where Finland relied on guerrilla tactics, Ukraine has taken that concept and supercharged it with 21st century technology. Drones, precision-guided artillery, and electronic warfare have amplified Ukraine's ability to outmaneuver and outsmart the Russian military. And just like Stalin, Putin is doubling down instead of adapting. His refusal to rethink his strategies is leading to devastating losses. The more he pushes, the more he falls into the same traps Ukraine has carefully set for him. Putin's desperation is palpable. He knows that his image as a strongman is unraveling, and the longer this war drags on, the weaker Russia looks on the global stage. As this war approaches its third year, it's clear that it has already reshaped global politics, military strategies, and perceptions of power. Still, the war is far from over, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But if one thing is clear, it's that Ukraine has already achieved what many thought was impossible.